Eagle 6 to Dustoff 3-4. We got one U.S. critical. Coordinates Yankee Tango 320-120. Contact Tango 22 on 4730. Over.
This was the standard call that Medevac helicopter crews received en route directly to the combat zone to pick up and rescue wounded soldiers from units in trouble. The modern Medevac system can transport wounded soldiers from the battlefield to the operating room in as little as 10 minutes, which is unbelievably fast. However, this speed does not come without its share of terror, as Medevac missions are often conducted under horrific conditions ranging from difficult weather and terrain to, most importantly, enemy fire. Medevac missions are some of the most terrifying operations conducted in warfare, and you will soon understand why. A Medevac mission only takes place when something has gone terribly wrong and the team rushes there as fast as possible. Modern helicopter Medevac, as we know it today, began to take shape during the Korean War, where the potential of helicopters was recognized to swiftly evacuate wounded soldiers from the front lines. Before this, medical evacuations had to be carried out by ground vehicles, which were slow and vulnerable to ambushes. Then helicopters changed everything with their ability to take off and land in tight spaces combined with their speed. During the Korean War, Bell H-13 helicopters were used, and despite many disastrous outcomes in the initial missions, they showed the enormous potential of helicopter Medevac. The concept was based on speed. The faster a wounded soldier could be taken off the battlefield, the greater the chances of survival. This gave birth to the concept of the golden hour, which would become the most important principle. Then came the Vietnam War, often called the Helicopter War, where helicopters showed their full potential. The legendary UH-1 Huey helicopter was designated for this task. With the call sign Dustoff, it flew thousands of missions, saving thousands of lives, but also came with extreme danger to its crews. Nearly half of the helicopters in the Vietnam War were shot down, with some crews surviving multiple crashes. Sadly, many of these were Dustoffs attempting to save the wounded. It sometimes happened that one helicopter was shot down, another came to pick up the surviving crew, and that second helicopter was also shot down, meaning the crew of the first downed helicopter was shot down twice in the span of an hour. This gives you an idea of just how risky these missions were. Often they operated under nearly impossible conditions, landing amidst enemy fire, trying to ensure no one was left behind. Despite everything, Medevac missions reduced the fatality rate for combat injuries from over 40% during World War II to less than 20% by the Vietnam War. Crews on duty would sleep beneath their helicopters, ready to be airborne within 2 minutes after hearing the mission horn. Although their shifts were supposed to last 8 hours, it wasn't uncommon for the same crew to fly for up to 20 hours, flying in and out of combat zones simply because they were needed. Along the way, mission details would come over the radio, including the number of wounded, their condition, the types of injuries, and the situation on the ground, as well as the location and activity of the enemy. Dustoffs maintained direct contact with ground troops, gunships, and the base. When close enough, ground troops would pop smoke grenades to mark their location, and the Medevac team would either attempt to land or lower a hoist to pick up the wounded. This was the most critical part of the mission because the enemy knew and waited for the helicopters, attempting to demoralize and damage them in every possible way. Hot landing zones meant the ground troops were in close proximity to the enemy and under heavy fire, which would quickly shift to the helicopters as they approached. After picking up the wounded, usually just seconds after touching down, they would immediately fly to the nearest evacuation hospital. The situation inside the helicopter on the way to the hospital was one of intense urgency and controlled chaos. Medics would immediately begin providing basic life support, performing CPR, applying tourniquets, stopping bleeding, etc., all while dealing with the helicopter's vibrations, evasive maneuvers, and sometimes enemy fire. It wasn't rare for Medevac crews to get wounded as well. They would relay the condition of the wounded so the hospital staff could be prepared upon arrival. Often, during larger engagements in the Vietnam War, the evacuation hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded, unable to accept them all at once. Helicopters would hover above the hospital, waiting in line to land one by one, unload the wounded, and fly directly back into the combat zone for more. Those with more critical injuries or damaged helicopters would cut the line and land first. There is a particular situation recalled by US Army nurse Linda van der Vanter in her book Home Before Morning, where she describes the horrific influx of wounded soldiers. She remembers seeing a badly damaged smoking dust-off loaded with wounded soldiers cutting the line of waiting helicopters. The helicopter landed, already semi-engulfed in flames, with everyone on board wounded, including the crew and pilots. They immediately shut down the engines and evacuated the helicopter, which was about to explode, with fire inching toward the fuel tanks. When everyone had escaped, they realized one crew member was still inside, unconscious, and no one dared to run back to a helicopter about to explode. Then one female nurse ran back, and another soldier followed her. They pulled the unconscious crew member out, and as they were running back, the helicopter exploded into a huge fireball. Luckily, they only sustained minor shrapnel wounds and managed to save the soldier. Wounded arrived in such numbers that many died simply because it was impossible to help them all at once. They had to be triaged into 3 categories based on the severity of their wounds. Immediate, which meant their life depended on immediate intervention. Delayed, which meant they were seriously injured but not in a life-threatening way. And expectant, meaning they had little to no chance of survival, even with treatment. Expectants were given pain relief and literally left to die, because trying to save them would take critical time and resources away from those who had a chance of survival. But that is the grim task of evacuation hospitals, and if you are interested in hearing more about the horror scenes that happened there during the Vietnam War, let us know in the comments and we can make a video about it. In theory, Medevac helicopters marked with large red crosses were supposed to be unarmed and not attacked by the enemy in any war. However, this is often the exact opposite when dealing with enemies who do not follow any rules. In many wars, Medevac helicopters have been prime targets, deliberately shot down, as seen in Vietnam. Because of this, crews began installing M60 machine guns to protect themselves, and also carried slightly heavier weapons than just .38 caliber revolvers. Medevac helicopters had to descend and hover over active combat zones, remaining vulnerable for some time to pick up the wounded, and the enemy was well aware of this. Helicopters are not bulletproof, and at low altitude they are vulnerable to even small arms fire, let alone heavier weapons. Some crews returned multiple times, even when their helicopters were riddled with bullets, barely able to fly, and with crew members already wounded, earning them the highest military honors. After missions, the inside of the helicopter would often be covered in blood. Sometimes they would land in shallow rivers to wash their helicopters, but if they didn't have time to clean up after the horrific aftermath of a Medevac mission, reinforcements being sent into combat on the same helicopter might faint or vomit upon seeing the horrifying scene inside, making them fear what now awaits them. After the Vietnam War, Medevac operations continued to evolve, but remained nerve-wracking and deadly. Faster and more reliable helicopters like the UH-60 Black Hawk replaced the Vietnam-era Hueys. They landed in the difficult terrains of deserts and mountains, and even on narrow city streets during urban combat. You've all seen the movie Black Hawk Down, which perfectly describes the situations Medevac teams can find themselves in as they tried to rescue the crews of 2 downed helicopters while coming under heavy fire from machine guns and RPGs from rooftops. Today, although humanity is constantly engaged in warfare somewhere, Medevac helicopters are not only used to evacuate wounded soldiers from battlefields, they play a crucial role in disaster response, medical emergencies, and search and rescue missions. In civilian life, Medevac helicopters are now a critical part of air ambulance services, providing rapid transport to hospitals for patients in critical condition, often from remote or hard-to-reach areas. However, this does not mean they are free from tremendous risks. There have been many instances where Medevac helicopters have crashed while selflessly risking their lives to help others.